possibility of participating in our political process in a meaningful and serious way. We'll talk more about that. We're very excited in particular, and I'll give Charity after the panel, I'll give Charity Wallace a chance to speak about it, that the Bush Center is very kindly offered to welcome us this fall to do a forum on women and democracy, and we're really excited to do that. I think it's going to be a great beginning of that journey. So with that, I'd like to welcome, we'll come back to this since I'd like to welcome our extraordinary and distinguished panel. All of whom really need no introduction. First of all, Anne Fulenwider, who I introduced before, the indomitable editor-in-chief of Marie Claire. And if you haven't picked up a Marie Claire recently, you really should, not just because we're in it in the January issue, thank you, although that helps. So thank you, Anne. But because Marie Claire, maybe more than any other magazine, has done an extraordinary job bringing very serious topics to young women and asking them to think deeply about a range of issues that they're not always asked to think about. Of John Gerzema, the CEO of BAV Consulting, which is an arm of Young and Rubicam. John is the author of an amazing book many of you have read called The Athena Doctrine. He has been a big supporter of ours from early on. He's also on the board of Girl Up, which is part of the UN Foundation, and has looked at how women's political leadership around the world can make a difference. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand. And Senator Gillibrand, you missed it. I said earlier that your panel last year with Susan Collins at Women of the World was actually one of the big inspirations for this and for our bipartisanship effort. So we're thrilled to have you. Of course, no one else in Congress perhaps has taken more of a serious leadership role on women's issues. Nancy LeaMond of AARP. I don't want to steal Anne's thunder. Many of you know AARP, 25 million members. Is that a low number?
38.
Oh, I knew I'd get it wrong. Thank you, Craig, for keeping me honest. 38 million members, and what's extraordinary, of course, about AARP is a huge percentage of those members are women, and they are enormously politically active. So lots to learn there. And then, of course, Representative Elise Stefanik, who we introduced earlier. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panel and welcome them up.
So good afternoon. I'm already totally inspired. Lauren, I feel there's no need for me to say anything. But this is such an extraordinary group of people focused on the same mission, and that's always a great way to start our post-Blizzard week. Did you and I, were the only two coming from New York? Were you in DC? I know you both are. The blizzard that wasn't in New York, but it was in DC. So I'd like to start with Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, whom I've most recently chatted about this with this past fall with the launch of your book, Off the Sidelines. You've spent so much time and so much effort getting women off the sidelines. And when I asked you last fall how we could get more women to run for office, you said, we need girls to play sports. Do you remember that? I'm sure it wasn't the only time you said it. So I want to talk to you a little bit about why that is, but why that helps. Maybe, and you mentioned the fear of competition or the fear of failure. But also, let's talk a little bit about not just running for office, but what other points of engagement there are for women who want to be involved in the political process.
Thank you. One of the reasons why I wrote my book, Off the Sidelines, is because I wanted to create a conversation among women about the things they care about. And through that conversation, to make the most important point that their voices are really important, that their worldview is different, that perhaps so different that it's not being reflected here in Washington, because we have so few women who are decision makers relative to men. We only have 20 women in the Senate. We only have 18% in the House of Representatives. We have very few women governors and a disproportionate underrepresentation in legislatures. And so the ideal is, how do we make sure the conversations and the decision-making happening at these tables of power reflect all of our views and all of our values? And it's a very important thing because the studies show that when women are part of decision-making, outcomes are better. So in corporate America, even though you only have 3% women as CEOs and 16% in corporate boards, when women are on those boards, higher returns on investment, higher returns on equity. If even one woman is on a corporate board, that company is 40% less likely to restate their earnings. That is a big detail. So it actually goes, to a recent study about risk. It was published in the New York Times about a month ago, I think. And I loved it because it tested male and female subjects on how they handled anxiety and high cortisol levels. And they tested it by putting their hands in very, very cold water to create that anxiety and that physical reaction. And then they asked them to make decisions. And the men who were taking this test started making riskier and riskier decisions, doubling down, higher bets, bigger bets until they failed. Whereas the women under these high stressful situations became much more focused, really was far more careful in their decision making and made better decisions. And so that makes sense when you say if a woman's on a corporate board, it's 40% less likely to restate their earnings, because that means when a company's in trouble, a woman is going to add a different perspective about how to handle decision making at that tough, difficult time, and it might be helpful. So, to politics. The same is true in politics. When women are on these boards, on these committees, hearings, when they're talking about issues, they often have a very different perspective of, one, what the problem is, and two, what the solution is. So the question becomes, if we want more women in governing, which we do, based on all these studies, how do you get them to say yes? And the challenge is they don't like the landscape. They really don't like the nature of politics. It's ugly, it's aggressive, campaigns are particularly ugly. They don't like all the negative ads. So there's a couple of things we can do to change the landscape. First thing is get money out of politics. One of the reasons why you have just so much money spent on negative ads is because we have, unfortunately, a Supreme Court who believes money is speech and that corporations have the same free speech rights as individuals. I don't think either of those conclusions is true as a matter of law or fact. And so we need to get to a place where there isn't an outsized influence of money in politics, because almost all those hundreds of millions of undisclosed cash go for negative ads. So that's one change.
So is that a realistic goal?
Yes, it is. You need a president who believes in campaign finance reform. You need a platform on the presidential level where you have a president who's fighting for it, believes in it, and is willing to explain to the American people what they already know. You ask any American, do you think money in politics is corrupting? They will say yes. And they will say, well, if they got $1,000, they must be just doing something for that $1,000. I mean, it's an indictment of the whole political system that money somehow changes your views, your vote, and how you represent your district. The second issue is so getting money out of politics, and number two, asking women to run anyway. So that means you have to say, listen, yes, this game is rough. It's like playing football. You know, you can put on your protective body gear and go out and play. Know what the rules of the road are, and assure them you can withstand it. You can withstand the hits. And just like any other sport she might be familiar with, let's say tennis, of course they're going to hit the hardest serve they can at you, but you know how to return it, and you're going to hit the hardest serve you can when you serve. That's the difference, to give them the context of fighting in a battle does not have to be prohibitive. That you know how to compete, you know how to win, you know how to lose, you know it's not that painful. And the one great thing sports does is teach girls that really early on. So I think sports is a great equalizer in terms of making young women less fearful of what it must feel like to lose, what it might feel like to be attacked, what it must feel like to respond to their best shot. Because it's no different than, frankly, any sport.
Congresswoman Stefanik, was that your experience running for office? Were you, hit on the battlefield and with your football pads on? Did you have a mentor?
Absolutely. I think every candidate and now member of Congress will say they were hit on the battlefield in order to get here. And I do have to mention, though, when Senator Gillibrand's book came out, I read it, and I was at the middle of the tail end of my general election. And even though we're from different political parties, our stories were similar in terms of what we were able to overcome. Different races, every campaign is different, every candidate is different. But as I read the book, I was able to gain confidence just by hearing another woman talk about the uphill battle that you had on your first congressional race, which now I represent a portion of. So that was a lesson for me. I think that the more examples we have in Congress and the more women from both sides of the aisle who are willing to talk about their experiences and talk about how they were able to overcome the negative ads, the criticisms, the unique challenges of being a female candidate is important. But I also think, one of the slides before, when we're discussing campaign finance, I think it's really important to teach young women that small donations are an investment in their future. If you want to see more women representatives, encouraging young women the importance of giving $25 to attend a local fundraiser, ensuring that you have a broad base of support and encouraging future donors is really important to help stop or to help basically get rid of the gap between the male and female donors. That's something that as a female candidate, it's hard to raise money, and you have to do that in order to show strength as a candidate. And I think being able to say we have a whole group of new donors who give smaller amounts, but it's young women who are engaged in the process, that's something that I prioritize in my race, and I'm going to continue prioritizing.
And just when you say, I want to refer back to what you said when you're sitting over there, if I knew now what I knew then, you kind of said you wouldn't run, right? So let's unpack that for a minute.
No. I actually talk about how my youth was actually an asset because I think it brings optimism, it brings a little bit of naivete, and after you are on the tail end of a campaign, which is an extraordinarily challenging process to go through, I'm actually glad that I took the huge risk, but your perspective changes at the end.
John, is this a branding problem that we have with getting women into the political process? We need to change this image of government and women being at odds with each other?
Yeah, I think it is, but I also think it's about society catching up. I mean, I think at the moment right now, culturally, we're in an adolescent age. You know, adolescents, if you think about the numbers, Senator Gillibrand just mentioned 16% of women on corporate boards, roughly 15% of women CEOs. I read last week there were only 17% of women at Davos. You know, in your teens, you're kind of reckless, right? And you're immature, and you're not really matured, and I think that that's really what this is about. And when we wrote this book, looking at the rise of feminine values in society, we went out and interviewed a range of really interesting people. And one of the people that really struck me was President of Israel, Shimon Peres, and he said to us, we're in a new world with many old minds. And this is at the time when he's, 90 years old, just having his birthday, but he was talking about the idea of leadership needing to adapt. And I think that's the time that we're in right now, because what we saw in our data was the rise of feminine skills and competencies. This is what people wanted around the world. 13 countries, 64,000 people. People were talking about not aggression, pride, and ego. They were actually negatively correlated to leadership. The things they were talking about was success through collaboration, through consensus building, through empathy, and through a lot of resilience and strength.
And just to go back to you, Congresswoman, because this touches on something you said, you just wanted to bring a new generation to Congress. Do you see faces like yours reflected in your work every day? I mean, how many 30-year-olds are there? You're the first woman.
There are a few other millennials. Actually, there's one other millennial in Congress, but there are a number of members who are in their 30s. It is an adjustment. I mean, I tell the story of the first week. There were many times where they didn't think I should be allowed on the House floor, but I had to show them my PIN, which is fine. I understand it. They're doing...
That PIN cost you $5 million. That is a or whatever your campaign was.
You know, your first PIN too. And lots of tears and blood and sweat along the way. So no, there aren't a lot of faces that I see that look similar to myself. But I think you have to own it as an asset. So for me, I realized that as a young female candidate, I was not the norm. And instead of running away from that, embracing it early on as part of the strategy of my campaign was really important. So little things like my campaign slogan was Elise for Congress. Typically, candidates use their last names. I decided I wanted to be young, new, fresh, and accessible. And a lot of voters would come up to me and say, we don't know your last name, but we know Elise. Vote for Elise when it comes to time on election day. So I think owning the youth is important, and I think it's great for the country because if you look at polling and data on political beliefs of millennials, it's not traditionally Republicans and Democrats as it was for, let's say, my parents' generation. And I hope there's a willingness to work together on some of the long-term issues that we're facing as a country.
Senator, you touched on the generational differences also when you, just in your book, for example, talked about none of these people had even seen a pregnant woman on the treadmill in the congressional gym. Nancy, speaking of the generational shift, I think is really interesting. Sure. And you are here with AARP, which I had Lauren's stat of 25 million, 38 million members.
Correct.
60 to 70% are women.
Correct.
And some of the most actively engaged on political issues.
Yeah.
So this is something that, obviously there's not millennials, but how do you do it? How do you get these women motivated to really take action?
Well, and I should point out, we're on the other side of the political spectrum, which is we try to influence people who are in elected office. We have about 20 million members who are women. They are the most engaged. The statistics are contrary to what you had on the screen earlier, which is our members typically are more likely to contact members of Congresswomen. They're more likely to write op-eds, letters to the editor, and be very engaged. And our leadership is across the country. And I think one thing we've done is, it's interesting, as an organization, even though our founder was a visionary woman and the majority of our leaders have been women, we tended not to think on an issue basis in terms of our women members and our male members. We were kind of agnostic, and we're beginning to look at that a little differently now and try and engage them on issues that we think are important. We do a lot of polling. In fact, you know, a pollster walks into the AARP building and thinks lifetime annuity. That's how much polling we do. But among the most interesting results, we had somebody come in recently who said they've done a lot of values polling. And what's the most important thing for a woman? And what's the most important thing for a man? And it turns out the most important thing for men was more money, and the most important thing for women was more time. And this insight was enormously helpful to us as we tried to think about engaging our members. And so we became very focused on what's the issue. Are they passionate about it? What are we asking them to do? It has to be personal. It has to be proximate, something close to them. And we've been pretty successful at that. I also wanted to add, though, that we're looking at something, and as a result of this, I'm going to go back probably and test it, which is everybody who spoke earlier spoke about the influence of their mother. And most of those mothers are members, thankfully. If they aren't, if you could please engage them to join us, it'd be great. But one of the things we thought about doing on an issue like financial security, which is so important that you have financial security earlier in life so you can save for retirement, is to engage and see if we can engage women and their daughters in an effort. So following this, I'm going to try that in one of our efforts.
Yeah, sounds interesting for Mary Claire, by the way. Senator, you spoke 6 months ago, I think, about 5 issues that are typically seen as women's issues, but are really just economic issues that are important for the entire country. And if we can engage women on them, we can make a difference in this country. I think that's a great point to start from for this group. Let me see if I can remember them. I have a bit of a cheat sheet, but you probably do too. Paid leave, affordable childcare, universal pre-K, equal pay, and minimum wage. Minimum wage maybe not always seen as a women's issue, but it certainly affects more women than men.
Well, I think they're all fundamental to creating a growing economy. Minimum wage, simply 2/3 of minimum wage workers are women. And for a lot of those women, they are tipped workers, and a tip means you are, whether you earn the minimum wage is up to either that patron or your boss to not lie about it. But that's unfair. So we should really focus on getting a livable wage for minimum wage, collapsing the two, having one minimum wage for all workers. That is a long-term effort. Things about childcare are fundamental to working moms. So universal pre-K and affordable daycare are fundamental. Most women who work, an average low-wage worker, minimum wage is $15,000 a year. Average daycare, $10,000 a year. So you are never going to be able to afford quality daycare for your child when he or she needs it most. And for every dollar you put into early childhood education, you get $11 out during that lifetime. It reduces the amount of criminal activity, it reduces the amount of trouble. All the things, all these indicators are benefited by early childhood education, and too many families don't have it. The toughest of all of them, and equal pay for equal work is obvious. It's absurd in this day and age that women are making 77 cents on the dollar to a male's dollar of the same work. Outrageous. For women of color, it's even lower. But paid leave is something that everybody in this room can do something about. We really need to have a national conversation about the value to a company of paid leave. Now, paid leave is not just about having babies, and this has to be focused on. It is about making sure when your mother is dying, you have time to be with her. When your spouse is ill, you have time to be with him. When your child gets hit by a car and he's in a wheelchair for 5 months, you can care for him and not lose your job when you have a baby. Those are the things that paid leave are for. It needs to be gender neutral. It needs to be for all of those necessities in family life. Because more often than not, it is the woman who will ramp off her career, take time off to meet those needs, because it's not palatable, it's not accepted, it's not gender neutral, it's not seen as gender neutral, and companies don't provide for it. Today, most people don't even have access to unpaid leave, let alone paid leave. And the percentage of people who have access to paid leave is at about 12%. That's pathetic. We are the only industrialized country in the world, in the whole world, that doesn't have paid leave. It is outrageous, and it is a drag on the economy, and let me explain why. Every time a woman has to ramp off her career, take time off, or quit her job, it means she is back down to the bottom rung. It means she never really gets hired on the same level for the same pay when she left. An example of a woman in upstate New York. Her daughter was hit by a car. She was in a wheelchair for 5 months. She had a master's degree. She was earning a good salary in the company she was with. Because her recovery took 5 months, she lost her job because we only guarantee only 3 months of unpaid leave. Lost her job. She never got hired again in her field at the same pay when she left. That's a drag. That means that income potential of all of those female workers is left on the table because she's earning less, she's not getting promoted, she's not accruing her retirement during any time that's unpaid. That's problematic. So if we care about reviving the economy, if we care about making sure our economy works at its full potential, then we should embrace paid leave like all of our competitors do. For companies that do it, Ernst & Young is here. Some of our best companies, Google, these companies offer paid leave, and when they do, they find not only are their employees more valuable, they're more efficient, they're more effective, happier workforce. It only accrues to the benefit of the company that's willing to do it. And there's studies that prove it out. So we as opinion leaders in our companies should demand it. I think it is so important. Even someone I know here who used to work on my staff who took 3 paid leaves, in her new company, got her paid leave program up to 3 months paid, because that is the state of the art. So all of us can take even a good policy, make it better, make it an industry baseline, make it competitive in terms of recruiting. Female employees are valuable. This is something that will keep them at a company over another company, and we should push it as a generation and as leaders.
So Nancy, if these are 5 points where we can, I would assume, and we can debate this later, a lot of the people in this room would agree are important, sure, and we can rally women around. And your constituents at AARP are rallied around passion points.
Sure.
Do you see this as a model? Like maybe, you know, AIT could take these 5 points, we could all decide how we're going to attack them, and that would, in your experience, rally more membership?
Sure. I think all of those points will resonate with people, and the question is how to get enough folks focused on a particular proposal or event. It has to be somewhat specific. I think there's a sleeper issue right now we found among our constituency and younger, and it speaks to what the senator mentioned in terms of leave, and that's caregiving. 7 out of 10 people in the United States this very day are caregivers, and not just for older members of the family, but younger members. And increasingly, people are seeing this as time away from work, time away from other activity. And it's when we did work in the last election, we found that it was ranked up there in terms of issues people cared about in the political arena, just under, for our membership, Social Security and Medicare, and that's pretty high up. I also think there's a lot of attention right now we're finding around the country. I'm curious whether you all are as well. Much more focus again on retirement security and as part of financial security. And it's so important. If you don't have enough of a wage to put a little bit away when you're younger, you're going to have a terrible problem later. We think these are galvanizing issues for our members and our members' kids and grandkids.
So there's a lot for us to work on. I will ask one last question, then maybe open it up to the group. Lauren, if that's a good model for you. John, you and I share a common interest, which is Girl Up, the United Nations Foundation's effort to reach the teenagers who I think are the hardest to reach. Yeah. What can we get? What's the value in speaking to them now? What is an issue we can galvanize them around, if anything, besides Taylor Swift or Katy Perry?
Well, if you're not familiar with Girl Up, please check it out. It's www.girlup.org. It is just a force of goodness. It is an amazing organization where you have tween and teen young women in America and now in the UK and other countries that are advocating policies for at-risk girls around the world. Recently, they've introduced HR 3398, which is the Girls Count Act, which is looking at how do we register all these young women from around the world so that they have access for records for healthcare and for education in the future. But this is a group of girls in their tweens and early teens that are really trying to change the world. And I think it's an amazing program, and it's the focus of the future of leadership, is if we can get these young girls into the mix. And what's interesting is they're now having a few boys that are joining the chapters. suddenly you're going to start to create a shift. You know, in our data, we see that millennials around the world, 13 countries, 72% of them would work for less money at a culture whose company values they admire. And I think that's the focus of this generation and Generation Z behind them. So let's get out there and let's really support this as a cause.
It's a very interesting moment about 70% of them would work at a place whose cause they believe in. So how do we get that ethos around politics and government? How do we, that's the sort of lead-off question, I would say. Because as you mentioned, Lauren, when you opened, is that our perception for those of us who are not in the government is that it's broken and that nothing's getting done.
So I'm actually a pretty big mouth, but
They might be recording you.
I'm mouthy. Yes, so I'm Susie Gordon with the Congressional Management Foundation, and I was just teeing off of that last statistic because we did a lot of research with congressional staff, and it turns out that that's exactly true of them, in fact, even higher. We compared how much the office culture and how much the, whether they contribute to their boss's goals, the office goals, is way more important to them than it is to the average American worker. And we have statistics from the Society for Human Resource Management to compare them with the general worker. And then Kirsten Gillibrand, you were just talking about, and I'm sure you know this as well, Ms. Stefanik, that staff actually don't, paid leave is very erratic and different between congressional offices. So I just kind of wanted to make a few observations about how the congressional staff, so the people who are actually going to, who will be influencing this policy, have that same level of passion. And of course, it's because a lot of them are millennials as well. So.
Yeah, it's, when I was elected in 2006, I created a paid leave policy for my office to mandate three months paid leave for any primary caregiver. So I wrote a state-of-the-art policy for our office, and our staff take it, and it's really important. We also have an extremely family-friendly office. It's okay to bring your kid to work if you need to. It's okay to miss work because you have a family emergency. And it's okay to miss work if it's your pre-K's graduation and you just want to be there. It's okay. And I know work can be done on other times, at other days, but these family moments are really important. And so, but most offices don't have any leave. If they have any, it might be 2 weeks. It's really minimal. And it's just, a lot of these congressional offices are so out of step. A lot of the members are male and older, so they don't remember what it's like to have an infant. And if they had infants, they weren't the primary caregivers, and most of them never brought an infant to a daycare center. So the whole idea of needing this support and flexibility isn't part of their own life experience, so they have nothing to draw from. I had 2 children in daycare. I know exactly how expensive daycare is. I know how unaffordable daycare is. I know how you need a quality daycare or you can't focus on your job. I know exactly what young parents are going through. And I'm lucky enough I don't yet know what it's like to have a dying parent, but I have friends who have had to nurse their parents with Alzheimer's or other debilitating diseases, and how distracting that is from your career and your job. So these are realities that unfortunately members of Congress are in these bubbles and they don't even see it. Also, unfortunately, a lot of staffers are young before they're even in childbearing years, and so they don't quite get it. As soon as they have kids, they get it. Again, it's just not as easy as it should be.
Senator, I think that goes to the point that that I've heard also about AARP, that, and it's just my human nature, and I'm sure many people can relate, is that you don't really do anything about anything until it's facing you right in the face. Like, oh my God, I've got to find a way to get my kids taken care of. I've got to go to this job interview. You know, or when Social Security is threatened, then everyone from AARP is getting on the phone and writing their Congress people, and I'm sure they do it other times as well. But when you're really sort of threatened and it's your person, you can relate to it personally, is when you really get engaged. So how can we either build on that or get beyond it? You know, get teenagers thinking about these things, or get a teenager to think they might want to run.
I just want to comment on AARP because, you know, for a lot of grandparents, they are now becoming primary caregivers.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, families across my state
Right.
are overwhelmingly being burdened because the grandparents who should be in their retirement years, who should be taking it easy, are forced to really take care of young children because there's no alternate care, there's no affordable care. So I think AARP could be a powerful advocacy force on paid leave because and universal pre-K and affordable daycare, because our grandparents are handling these issues today at a time they don't even have the physical energy or the time to do all the things that are being asked of them. And I think it's becoming a huge burden on the retired population. And I bet they could be very forceful in pushing these ideas.
What are some other passion points besides paid leave where we can rally women to enter this sphere?
One of the suggestions I have, and there have been other elected officials, business leaders who have really helped embrace this, but using women's magazines as a platform to reach new types of readers. And I know that you talk about this in your book, Off the Sidelines, doing interviews for health magazines, which I'm a reader of. I know that many of my age group women read, and I think that it's very important that we are examples, whatever sector that you're in, whatever industry that you happen to be a leader of, that you go out and talk to those media outlets that don't necessarily typically cover elected officials, and Marie Claire's done a great job of highlighting female candidates, and so have the other magazines. But I think that's really important because what I found is you're reaching a whole new readership and a whole new audience who wouldn't necessarily be engaged in the day-to-day of politics and public policy, but they start getting involved and interested and see how it affects their lives. That's a way, regardless of what your background is, if you happen to be a leader in your industry, reaching out to women's magazines, because I think it's helpful to be examples for younger women reading them.
Yes, and I have a number of cards I can hand out. They're the first place that you reach out. What are some other questions?
Okay, great. I'm Vicki Szabo from the National Partnership for Women and Families, and want to thank Senator Gillibrand for her leadership on paid leave, on equal pay, on minimum wage, and just to underscore something that the senator said, and thank her for her leadership on the Family Act in particular, which is the Family and Medical Insurance Leave Act, which would create a national paid leave insurance program modeled on some states that have had success in this area. It is critically important just to underscore that business leaders are talking not just about their own practices, but also thinking about how we can set standards in this country that make things better for everybody, whether it's the parent caring for a child, or whether it's a child caring for a parent, or whether it's a worker who themselves have had their retirement savings wiped out and need to keep working longer. And there's a growing momentum. You heard the president talking about this issue. It's really only a matter of time before we change. And it's encouraging to see leaders on both sides of the aisle adopting sort of the same narrative and the same rhetoric about the challenges that working families are facing. And so to Lauren's point at the beginning, I think this is a really important place for women leaders in particular in Congress to come together, but also to draw male colleagues into the narrative about the fact that the workforce is changing, that women are earning more incomes, that people are working later, that our birth rate is falling, and to really talk about where we can find common ground on solutions. So I just want to thank you for that, and maybe ask the two of you for your perspectives about how to think about bringing your colleagues together to talk about this.
I have a lot of resonance in the Senate now on making daycare more affordable. So for example, Rand Paul is on a bill to make it a business deduction and double the deduction. Senator Burr is on a bill to our health savings accounts to apply them to daycare and double or increase the amount in it, so you could go up to $7,500. Those are both very bipartisan bills, and I've been working with a number of offices on the paid leave policy. That's a bigger long-term conversation, but we just need one, because once you have one strong leader, like a presidential candidate, like we have on these other bills, it makes a huge difference, because it allows people to say, you know, this is a good idea. It's not a Democratic idea. It's not a Republican idea. It's just a common sense, good idea that helps all families and helps the economy grow, because it's a numbers issue. It's an absolute economic engine. And so you make the case to business, you make the case to the country on a bipartisan basis, you will solve these problems. So I'm optimistic.
There's a question.
Go ahead. Lily's answer for the House.
I was just going to say that I think one of the
I'm not answering for the House.
I'm not answering for the House. Taking a step back, I think one of the most important roles that women elected officials can play is making sure that the perspective of women is represented across all policy issues. Oftentimes, and you probably felt this way, you're the only woman in the room, whether it's a subcommittee you're on or a committee meeting, and you happen to be the only voice there. So making sure that whatever the policies are regarding economic policies, healthcare policies, that you speak up and make sure that that female perspective is represented. One crystallizing moment in my campaign, and I've only been in office for 3 weeks, so I talk a lot about the campaign. I was in a fundraising meeting, and they chose 3 candidates. The 2 other candidates were great candidates. They happened to be men, and it was in New York City, and the entire room was filled with male donors. I was literally the only woman in the room, probably about 40 of us. And the 2 other candidates presented. I was the last one to present. And calling it out and talking to the donors and talking to whatever group you're in, saying, I'm going to state the obvious here. We have a problem. This is what Congress looks like. You're missing these types of faces here. And luckily, a lot of them wrote checks because they realized they were probably embarrassed that I was the only woman in the room. But it's really important to do that, not only on policy issues in Congress or in campaigns, but in your industries. Call it out when you are the only voice in the room so that there's an awareness of the necessity of expanding the tent.
I know there's a question over here.
Kristen.
Kristen?
Yeah, Kristen.
Hi, good afternoon. Christy Smith, Managing Partner at Deloitte. I'm also a millennial trapped in a card-carrying AARP body. So appreciate that both are represented on the panel. So I want to react, John, to something that you said, which was that we are in our adolescence, which I firmly disagree with. I'm sick of having this same conversation that we've been having for 30 years, and I'm old enough to know that we've been having this conversation for 30 years. The reality is accountability. Because what your comment smacks of is when I talk to CEOs that say, well, I just don't have the pipeline. Well, that's crap, put nicely. Yep. Because when you look at the numbers of women or people of color coming into organizations, graduate schools, they are at their prime and hitting leadership positions now. So what I want to make sure that we are clear on is that this is about accountability at the top. For far too long, we've abdicated the responsibility of human flourishing and the things that the senator certainly has been talking about for a number of years to a couple of people in our organizations rather than the responsibility of every single leader. So I guess my question is, I think the private sector has a significant role here, and we need to have accountability at the top for leading on these issues. Just like we did when the private sector came together around marriage equality and pushed that through, these are the issues that we need to engage the private sector around in partnership or with the public sector. So how do we do that?
Yeah, and I meant the comment as a criticism on the 20th century. I think we're in, as President Perez said, the new world with old minds. We've got a whole bunch of 20th century companies that have not adapted to the 21st century, and this has gone on for far too long. I think one of the really big parts of it in my business in branding and marketing is just to look at consumerism. I mean, consumerism drives 72% of America's GDP. You have the power of your wallet to support these companies that have strong values, that have strong policies at their core, that have strong leaders that are looking either at triple bottom lines or they are promoting women into leadership, into organizations. And there's some really interesting companies that are doing that. There are companies that are developing citizenship metrics to make sure that they have appropriate numbers of women on their boards as well as in leadership. They've got companies that are focusing on having millennials on their external board, basically a group of pale, stale male guys that are actually getting advice from millennials to try to understand really what the world is all about. But I think it does come down to large part to consumerism. We've got a huge opportunity to support companies that are doing the right thing.
And does every company now know, I mean, I feel like it's been hammered into my head that it makes economic sense to do this? I mean,
exactly.
They don't know it yet.
They don't.
Actually don't.
They don't.
Actually, it's willful blindness,
right.
in my opinion. Willful blindness. They like the way it is. They want to keep it the way it is, period. So I love your point, and I one piece of advice is this. So Susan Wojcicki wrote this great piece for about Google. She was the first employee to go on maternity leave. She writes her opinion. This is really helpful to have every woman of every major company who has an opinion on this to be heard on her opinion and to get it into the ether, because it creates national conversations. And our nature is often that we are polite. Often we are kind. Often we care what other people think. Often we don't want to rock the boat. I'm asking you to please rock the boat. Please be a pain in the ass. Please be heard on this issue. Because if you don't, we're never going to win. We are never going to win this. And the reason why the gay rights movement is doing better than us is because a lot of the men who are leading that began to put their money where their mouth was, began to cross partisan lines. Senior Republicans who are gay rights activists said, I'm not going to support my party if you don't do something. I mean, they translated their passion into leverage, into action. Women, by nature, don't do that as often. We just don't. And it's harder for us. It's something we typically don't like to do. It's why we don't negotiate our first salaries. We don't want to rock the boat on the first day. So 7% of women negotiate their first salaries, but 57% of men do. Men could give a shit if they rock the boat on the first day. They are happy to do it. I'm worth everything. I need more money now because I'm awesome. Sheryl Sandberg's point, because I'm awesome. All the men around her keep saying that about themselves, and we often don't say that about ourselves. We often don't fight for the fight because we believe in it. So I think what our movement needs is a very strong call to action. We have to fight harder. We have to be heard. We have to make our peers uncomfortable. We have to negotiate those. We have to do all these things and be as effective as we can. And we have the skills to do that. We have the leadership ability. Enough of us have risen in the ranks in enough companies that we can make a national narrative, use the platforms we have. This conference in and of itself is an amazing thing. So we just have to translate all the power. Now, in terms of the buying power, because this is the greatest idea, but we haven't yet figured out how to translate that. So now we have the EDGE Awards where we can award companies based on whether they have women in leadership, whether they have paid leave policies. We could rate them. But no one has developed the app yet, and I keep asking Silicon Valley to figure this out, where you can rate all the companies that you purchase things at, and what's the rating in terms of, are they good with women in leadership? Are they good with paid leave? Are they good with equal pay? Are they good with all the things we care about? What's your woman rating? Like, are you good on these things that we care about? I would love to have that app on my phone. So if you have a choice between two companies and one's good at it, one's not, you can just put your money where your mouth is, if that's your issue. But I'd love that app to be developed. That would be super helpful.
I think it's a great
To feminists like me.
One more question?
Hi.
Okay.
Okay, sorry. Hi, my name's Tanya Williams, and I don't want to take us off the point because I agree 100% with what everyone has said on this panel and support all of the points that Senator Gillibrand raised and that we've been talking about. But one thing that you said was just really interesting to me. You said when you relate to people personally, when you make it personal to them, you can get them engaged. And so one of the things that I just want to make a point about and sort of challenge us is a group of women that we often don't talk about, and those are single women. We quickly descend into talking about families and time off for mothers and things like that, all of which are important, all of which single women absolutely support as well. But we have a growing number of single women who are working, who have similar challenges, who have different challenges. And it's a group that I think we don't talk to a lot. There's not a lot of outreach there on the part of the women, coming out and, raising your hand and saying, well, what about this? Does that mean that you don't care about, other issues that families and women with children are facing and things like that? So anyway, I just wanted to really just sort of challenge us to broaden the group of people that we're talking about. We are, Senator Gillibrand, to your credit, the equal pay and other issues also speak to those folks as well. But I just wanted to sort of mention that point because it's a growing number of voters and people in general that I think sometimes we miss.
And members of Congress.
And members of Congress.
Yeah.
I'd love to just add one thing and also tee up a question and then continue the conversation.
Part of what we wanted to commit to in our work at All In Together was, first of all, that we're not going to pick a set of issues for American women. We want American women to act on what matters most to them because we are incredibly diverse. And one of the, I think, big challenges has been, that if we define issues for women in a particular sphere, they may not resonate for all women. And we want women to stand up and speak about what matters most to them individually and give them the tools to do that don't require them to sign on to agree with these 5 things in order to do 2 others. But what I wanted to ask, and I think is an important discussion, is what the impact would be on the Hill, what the impact would be on American politics if we really did fulfill our goal and women were speaking up and advocating on all the things that matter to them equal to their numbers. How different would lawmaking in Washington maybe be? Would we get different outcomes if women were writing the same number of letters to their members, speaking up at town halls at the same rates, writing op-eds? I'd love to know if either of you think is that going to change things?
I think it does. I think our democracy only works when regular people stand up and demand action. And so if you have 51% of the population becoming more vocal, stronger advocates for the things they want, regardless of what they are, you're going to have very different outcomes. And that's why I think the call to action is the most important thing we can create as media companies, as leaders, as community advocates, to say our voices are so important and they really are different. And if they're not being heard, we won't see an agenda or solutions that reflect our values. So I think it would have a huge effect.
I think it would have a huge effect too. One of the parts that I've noticed this past month is women are very good reaching out across the aisle, that you definitely stick together, and there's opportunities for bipartisan legislation that, you know, we're good at finding common ground. We are good at listening to one another, I think, in a way that our male colleagues can learn from. And I think that if we increase the number of women that's more reflective of the voting population, you'd see a Washington that's more functional. What I heard, and I'm sure every candidate has heard this past election cycle, people are upset with the gridlock. And we've seen stories that the only people in the Senate who are willing to talk to each other are the women senators. This is something that I think it would be tremendously, it would change the culture of policymaking in Washington.
Sam.
Can you get a mic? Oh, here. Thanks. Thank you. He's got it.
Hello? Yeah. Earlier, you said something like, when you look at Washington and you're not very involved, you see it as broken. And the Congresswoman talked about speaking out or calling out something that's broken. And I want to do that for a second. The problem is, as I see it, if women or men find a passion point and move into organizations, too often the organizations treat them as kindergartners. Click this petition, done. Online letter, done. It's all kindergarten. It's important, but it's kindergarten. And one quick story, I was in UK speaking at an NGO, non-governmental group with 700 staff in the head office, and I was talking to 12 of their campaigners, and I put the first two, I have these NGO attitudes that kill citizen empowerment and transformation, and I got them from talking to NGOs. I put the first two attitudes that kill empowerment, and the woman in the room said, that's us. Number two, that's us. And it was, we can't have our volunteers write letters to the editor or op-eds because they'll get it wrong and misrepresent the organization. And I'd gotten it from their sister organization in the United States, that particular attitude. And I said, yeah, if you give them a kindergarten curriculum and then ask them to write a letter to the editor, they'll get it wrong and misrepresent. If you give something deeper, they won't get it wrong. And last thing, I said, the group that told me this said, we have 15 media staff at head office. They do the media. I said, yeah, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post. Who's doing the Salt Lake Tribune or the Seattle Times or the Miami Herald where Congress is? Not your media staff. That's where Congress is. And so the point is, even if we find our passion point, we can often go into NGOs who are also broken and are going to treat us like kindergartners, and we have to find NGOs that take us to 3rd, 5th, 9th, 12th in college as advocates.
It's a very good point. And Lauren, we have 5 minutes left for our panel, so please tell me if you have more questions. But correct me if I'm wrong in the mission of AIT, which is that, so a lot of women think, okay, well, I can't run for office. That's too hard. So the only other option I have is maybe click on this, to your point, button on my, I clicked on something I got on Twitter, and it says, click this if you agree, or write your senator. So we're trying to find what else there is, right?
Yeah, and part of what we want to try to do is also educate women en masse around what really makes an impact, right? So that if you really are passionate about X, Y, or Z issue and you get sent a petition about it, Sam is right. I mean, it has much more impact on your representative if you send them, if you are as a verified constituent, send a letter to them as your representative about how you want them to vote on the issue. And I've learned a lot. My wonderful friend Rashna Chowdhury is here, who runs PopVox, which is a new website, a web tool that's focused on helping create verified constituent letters on virtually any bill, right, that's up in Congress. Every bill that's up in Congress. So you can research the bill and then write a verified constituent letter, and you can track who's for and against. These are the kinds of tools that we need American women to understand better and to engage with. Because if we really want to have voice in the process, we have to understand how the process works. And we've done this very successfully in many ways with professional women, helping them kind of crack the code. What does it take to get ahead? You need a sponsor, you need a mentor, you need these 3 things, and this is going to help you if you want the top job. We have to do that with the American political process. We need to help people understand how does it really work, what do our representatives respond to, and then give women the tools to do that. I believe that they will act if we give them the right tools and resources, but we have to help them understand it first.
And prove that they work.
And prove that they work.
I think, go ahead.
No, I was just, a couple of years ago, people came to us with issues that were not high on our agenda, but important, and we created this website called Create the Good, and provided toolkits on a whole range of issues that you might not think AARP would engage in. And I, of course, said, oh, I don't think this will work, but let's do it, and of course, proved to be wrong. We have 650,000 people who have come to the website, downloaded something on the environment in my neighborhood, how to do a walking survey. None of it is pejorative. None of it says you have to do this, you can't do this. There's tremendous energy and tremendous enthusiasm. 60% of those people are women. Excuse me.
I think a goal for this group, and it could be a challenge to both national media and local media outlets, is I think you're starting the organization that's basically going to talk about the gender revenger, challenging the op-ed pages to make sure that there's more parity in terms of bylines and who the writers are. I know that elected officials at all levels, local to federal level elected officials, pay close attention to their local papers and the national papers, and that's something that, you know, as a young woman right out of college, I noticed very acutely how few women, I think it was 10%, are on op-ed pages. We need to get that close to 50%, and I think that's a measurable goal, and you can work with other media outlets to make that happen.
I was just going to say that I think the 10% is abysmal, but from what I hear from my colleagues in the media is that that's somewhat representative of what they're getting. So they're not like, you know, saying, oh, it's a woman, we can't publish it. They're just, they're just publishing sort of a general, smaller percentage of what they're getting. So we need to encourage women to write their.
And why it matters. And that's the problem. If fewer women are writing, that's what we need to crack. That's the problem that this group can help.
Okay, so this is the last question. Pam.
I'm Pam Stevens, and I'm very lucky to have worked for incredible women, Nancy Reagan, Condi Rice, and Kathleen Morris Rogers.
You want to use?
And Pam Stevens. I worked for Nancy Reagan, Condi Rice,
Sorry, you're going to say your name one third time for the record.
I'm Pam Stevens, and I'm lucky enough to have worked for Nancy Reagan and Condi Rice and Chair McMorris Rogers. And Condi did Good Housekeeping magazine, along with what you said, Elise. She said in her entire career, she'd never gotten more comments in doing any media than doing that. So I say to you as an editor, and I'll say the same thing to Robbie Myers and Leslie Jane Seymour and to Cindy Levy, etc. Tell your readers, write op-eds, call your congresspeople, write letters to your congresspeople, get involved. Anne is coming next week, and she's meeting with the Republican, I'm sure she'll meet with the Democrats, the Republican members of Congress, female, and the Republican senators. And I've been doing that with a lot of our women's magazines. And thank you so much for being interested in what we do, in what we cover, and what's more affirming to a young woman than being a part of something bigger than yourself. So thank you both for running for what you do and being an example to young women and to all Americans.
Thank you. So thank you all for your participation today, and we'll head it out back to the world. We're going to take a 5-minute break. So this whole time I'm trying to lip read, but Lauren is telling me. So I generally think she wants us to take a break right now.
Yeah, we'll
but thank you so much, all of you.
5-minute break.
Thank you all.